The reinforced glass of the West Wing didn't just shatter, it exploded inward like a hail of diamonds, soaked in blood. I didn't hear the alarm first. I heard the scream. It was a wet, jagged sound, the kind of noise a throat makes when it's being peeled open from the inside out. My name is Elias Thorne, and 30 seconds ago, I was a Secret Service agent on the Alpha Shift, standing guard outside the Oval Office. Now, I'm a man standing in a graveyard made of white marble and history. The air in the hallway was suddenly thick with the metallic tang of blood and the scorched hair smell of a deployed flashbang. I gripped my Sig Sauer P229 so hard the grip checked into my palm. My partner, Miller, a guy who'd survived 3 tours in the sandbox and a dozen close protection details, wasn't moving. He was pinned against the wainscoting by something that used to be a White House intern. It was a girl, maybe 21, in a torn navy blue blazer, but her eyes were clouded over like spoiled milk, and her jaw was unhinged, snapping at the air with a rhythmic, mechanical hunger. Miller's throat was a red ruin. He looked at me, his eyes wide with a terrifying clarity, before the light in them just went out. I didn't have time to mourn. I didn't have time to pray. I just fired. 2 to the chest, 1 to the head. Standard training. The intern's head snapped back, a spray of gray and black hitting the portrait of Jackson behind her. But she didn't fall. She just staggered, her head lolling on a snapped neck, and kept coming. That was the moment the American dream died for me. Right there, in the heart of D.C. I shoved past the twitching remains of my friend and sprinted toward the Situation Room. The emergency lights were already strobing, casting a rhythmic, hellish crimson glow over the corridors. Every few yards, I saw the signs of the collapse. A discarded high heel, a smeared handprint on the cream-colored wallpaper. The silence was the worst part. A heavy, suffocating silence, broken only by the distant, rhythmic thudding of something heavy hitting a door. My radio was a chaotic mess of static and screaming. Sector 4 is compromised. We have a code black. Repeat, code black. Then, a voice I recognized, the chief of staff screaming about his legs before the transmission turned into a wet, crunching sound. I hit the heavy blast door of the sit room and punched in my override code. Nothing. The keypad was dead, flickering with a mocking system error. I heard a sound behind me. A low, guttural rattling. I turned, my breath hitching in my chest. Down the hall, near the press briefing room, a group of them were huddled over something. They moved with a jerky, insect-like coordination. They weren't just eating. They were dismantling. I thought about my wife in Alexandria. I thought about the mortgage on our little split-level ranch, the golden retriever waiting by the door, the way the sun hits the Potomac on a Sunday morning. It all felt like a movie I'd seen a lifetime ago, a fantasy. The reality was the SIG in my hand, and the growing realization that the most secure building on the planet was now a pressurized tomb. I retreated toward the service elevator, my boots slipping on something slick and warm. I passed the kitchen area, where the smell of expensive coffee was being drowned out by the stench of an open sewer. A chef in a white toque was slumped over a stainless steel prep table, his body jerking in the throes of the change. I didn't wait. I hammered the button for the sub-basement. As the door slid shut, a hand, pale, cold, and missing 3 fingers, slammed between them. I kicked it with everything I had, hearing the bones snap like dry kindling, and the doors hissed closed. I was alone in the dark, descending into the guts of the White House, while the world I swore to protect was being torn apart by teeth and nails above me. I checked my mags. 2 full, 1 half spent. My tactical light flickered. I wasn't just an agent anymore. I was a ghost in the machine of a dying empire, and the only thing that mattered was finding a way out of this white-walled nightmare before the things upstairs figured out how to use the stairs. I could feel the vibration in the elevator cables. Something was climbing down after me. Not one thing, dozens. The hum of the motor was being drowned out by the scratching of nails on steel. I reached for my radio one last time, hoping for a miracle, but all I heard was the president's voice, distorted and small, reciting the Lord's Prayer until he started to gag. This wasn't a riot. This wasn't a coup. This was the end of everything, and I was standing in the middle of the wreckage with a badge that didn't mean a damn thing anymore. The elevator groaned, a guttural sound of protesting metal that vibrated through the soles of my boots. Above me, the scratching intensified, the sound of jagged fingernails and exposed bone dragging across the polished steel of the shaft walls. They weren't just falling. They were climbing down the cables, driven by a hunger that had erased every vestige of the men and women they used to be. I looked up at the ceiling hatch, the thin metal vibrating under the weight of something heavy landing on top of the car. Dust shook loose from the recessed lighting. I didn't have much time. I jammed my shoulder into the emergency manual release, my breath coming in ragged, shallow hitches that tasted of ozone and copper. The doors hissed open only halfway, snagging on some unseen obstruction. I didn't wait. I holstered my P229, grabbed the edges of the doors, and hauled them apart with a grunt of pure, adrenaline-fueled desperation. I spilled out into a dimly lit maintenance corridor, the smell of damp concrete and old grease hitting me like a physical blow. Behind me, the elevator car shrieked as the cables finally gave way under the collective weight of the things above. The car plummeted, a screaming whistle of air followed by a bone-jarring crunch that echoed up from the sub-basement depths. For a second, there was silence. Then, the howling started. I scrambled to my feet, my tactical light cutting a frantic arc through the gloom. This was level 4, the deep guts, the service arteries that bypassed the ceremonial opulence of the floors above. Here, the walls weren't white. They were raw cinder block, sweating with condensation. My light flickered, the beam yellowing as the batteries bled out. I cursed under my breath, tapping the casing against my palm. Focus, Miller. Focus on the deck. I checked my mag again. 19 rounds total. 19 rounds to get through a mile of tunnels and out into a city that was likely already a funeral pyre. My radio chirped, a burst of static that made my heart hammer against my ribs. The president's voice was gone now, replaced by a wet, rhythmic slapping sound, the sound of something heavy being dragged across a carpeted floor. Then, a low, guttural moan that ended in a sickening wet snap. The commander-in-chief was no longer the leader of the free world. He was just meat. I moved low, hugging the wall, my footsteps muffled by the thick rubber soles of my tactical boots. Every shadow was a threat. Every hum of a transformer was a scream in waiting. I reached a junction where the corridor split, left toward the Presidential Emergency Operations Center, PEOC, right toward the tunnel that supposedly connected to the Treasury Department. The PEOC would be a tomb by now, filled with the highest-ranking officials in the land who had locked themselves into a reinforced steel box with a virus they didn't understand. I chose right. I hadn't gone 50 feet when I saw the first sign of what was coming for me down here. A trail of blood, black as oil in the beam of my light, smeared along the floor in a wide, jagged streak. It led toward a heavy security door that hung loosely on its hinges. I slowed my pace, my finger tightening on the trigger. The silence here was heavy, pressurized. I could hear the thrum of my own pulse in my ears, a frantic drumbeat that seemed loud enough to wake the dead. As I approached the door, a shape detached itself from the darkness. It was wearing a suit, a charcoal gray Brooks Brothers that I recognized. It was Agent Henderson, my training officer. He was slumped against the wall, his head lolling at an impossible angle. One of his arms was missing from the elbow down, the bone splintered and white against the red ruin of his sleeve. I froze, my light fixed on his face. His eyes were milky, clouded over with the film of the dead, but they tracked the light with a predatory twitch. He started to rise, his movements jerky and uncoordinated, like a marionette with tangled strings. "Henderson," I whispered, a stupid, reflexive plea for the world to make sense again. He didn't answer with words. He lunged, a frantic snapping motion, his teeth clicking together inches from my throat. I didn't think. I reacted. I took a step back, pivoted, and drove the butt of my pistol into his temple. He hit the floor hard, but he didn't stay down. They never stayed down unless you destroyed the processor. I stood over him, looking into the face of the man who had taught me how to scan a crowd for a glint of steel. I pulled the trigger once. The suppressed pop was swallowed by the tunnel walls. Henderson stopped moving. I leaned against the cold concrete, my chest heaving. The weight of it was starting to crush me. The realization that there was no outside to run to. This wasn't a localized event. If the most secure house in the world had fallen this quickly, the streets of D.C. would be a slaughterhouse. I checked my light again. It was fading faster now. I needed to move. I pushed through the security door and found myself in the steam tunnels. The air was hotter here, thick with the hiss of leaking pipes and the smell of sulfur. It was a labyrinth of rust and shadow. I moved through the narrow catwalks, the metal grating clanking under my feet. Below me, in the dark pits of the machinery, I heard movement. A lot of it. The scratching was back, but it wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was everywhere. They were in the pipes. They were in the vents. I reached a ladder that led up to a maintenance hatch near the east wing exit. My hands were shaking as I gripped the cold iron rungs. Halfway up, my light finally died, plunging me into a darkness so absolute it felt like a physical weight. I stopped, hanging there in the void, listening. Above me, the hatch was closed, but I could hear the faint, muffled sounds of the world outside, sirens, screaming, and the staccato rhythm of distant gunfire. It sounded like a war zone. Below me, I heard a hiss, then the sound of something wet hitting the metal grating. Something was climbing the ladder. I reached into my vest and pulled out a chemical light stick. I cracked it, the neon green glow flooding the shaft with a sickly, artificial light. Looking down, I saw 3 of them. They were naked, their skin stripped raw by the tight confines of the pipes they'd crawled through. Their eyes were wide, vacant, and fixed on me. They moved with a terrifying insectoid grace, their fingers hooking into the rungs with unnatural strength. I didn't have the angle to shoot down without risking a fall. I scrambled up the remaining rungs, my boots slipping on the rust. I reached the hatch and slammed my shoulder against it. It was locked. I hammered at the deadbolt, my breath coming in panicked gasps. The first thing reached my ankle. It's cold, slick fingers wrapping around my boot. I kicked down with everything I had, feeling the crunch of a nose, but the grip didn't slacken. I pulled my sidearm and fired blindly down past my own leg. The flash of the muzzle blinded me for a split second, but the weight on my leg vanished. I fired again and again until the ladder was clear for a heartbeat. I turned back to the hatch, drew my combat knife, and jammed it into the gap of the locking mechanism, prying with the strength of a man who refuses to die in a hole. With a scream of straining metal, the bolt sheared off. I threw the hatch open and scrambled out into the air. I was in the rose garden, or what was left of it. The sky was an ugly, bruised purple, choked with the smoke of 100 fires. The White House behind me was a silhouette of broken windows and licking flames. The lawn, once a pristine emerald carpet, was littered with bodies. Some still, others crawling with a horrific, purposeful slow motion. The fence line was a nightmare. The black iron pikes were draped with the dead who had tried to climb over, while thousands more pressed against the perimeter from the outside. The sound was a low, constant roar, the collective moan of a city turned into a graveyard. I stood there, a lone figure in a tattered suit, holding a gun with a handful of bullets and a badge that was just a piece of cold tin. I looked toward the Treasury building, then toward the mall. The Washington Monument stood in the distance, a white needle piercing the smoke, but the flags at its base were tattered and stained. The psychological toll hit me then, a wave of vertigo that nearly took my knees out. Everyone I knew, everyone I had worked with, was either dead or turning. My family in Virginia, my friends in the city, they were gone. I was the last sentinel of a fallen kingdom. I felt a cold laughter bubbling up in my throat, a hysterical reaction to the absurdity of it all. I had spent my life preparing for assassinations, for dirty bombs, for political coups. I had been trained to take a bullet for the man in the Oval Office, but no one had trained us for this. No one had a protocol for the end of the soul. Movement to my left. A group of them, formerly members of the grounds crew, were shuffling toward me across the grass. They were slow, but their numbers were growing. I looked at my pistol. 1 mag left. 1. I couldn't fight my way out of the city. I couldn't even fight my way across the lawn. I looked back at the hatch I'd just crawled out of. The things from the tunnels were starting to emerge, their pale heads popping up like ghouls from the earth. I was trapped between the monsters of the deep and the monsters of the world. I started to run. Not toward the gate, that was suicide, but toward the motorcade graveyard near the South Portico. I remembered the armored Suburbans. If I could get to one, if the keys were in the ignition, or if I could bypass the security, I might have a chance. The thick glass and reinforced steel would buy me time. I sprinted across the lawn, my lungs burning, the green glow of my light stick still clutched in my left hand like a dying torch. I passed the remains of a Marine One helicopter that had clipped the trees and slammed into the ground. Its rotors were twisted like the limbs of a giant insect, and the smell of aviation fuel was thick enough to choke on. I reached the first Suburban. The driver's side window was starred but not broken, level 4 armoring. I pulled the handle. Locked. I moved to the next one. The door was hanging wide open, the interior sprayed with a fine mist of blood that had already turned brown. The keys were dangling from the steering column. I dived inside and slammed the door, punching the locks just as the first of them reached the glass. A face slammed against the window. A woman in a summer dress, her jaw hanging by a single tendon, her eyes wide with that mindless, eternal hunger. She began to beat on the glass with her forehead, a dull thud-thud-thud that echoed in the small cabin. I turned the key. The engine coughed, sputtered, and died. "Come on," I hissed, slamming my hand against the dashboard. "Come on, you piece of shit." I turned it again. The starter whined, a pathetic sound against the roar of the crowd outside. More of them were surrounding the car now, their bodies pressing against the metal, their hands obscuring the windows. The car began to rock as they pushed and pulled, their collective strength enough to tilt the multi-ton vehicle. I felt the panic rising again, a cold snake coiling in my gut. I closed my eyes for a second, forcing myself to breathe. Standard procedure: check the fuel, check the lines. I realized the fuel cutoff might have been triggered by whatever chaos had happened here earlier. I fumbled under the dash, my fingers finding the reset switch. I flipped it and turned the key one more time. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, violent sound that drowned out the scratching. I slammed the shifter into drive and floored it. The Suburban lurched forward, thumping over bodies like they were nothing more than fallen logs. I cleared the portico and headed for the southwest gate. The iron gates were closed, but the Suburbans were designed to be battering rams. I gripped the wheel, tucked my chin, and didn't look back at the White House. I hit the gates at 40 miles per hour. The sound of rending metal was deafening. The airbags didn't deploy, thank God for the override, and I burst through the perimeter like a bullet leaving a barrel. But as I reached Pennsylvania Avenue, I saw the truth. The street was a river of them, thousands upon thousands, a sea of gray skin and tattered clothes, stretching as far as the eye could see toward the Capitol. There was no road left. There was only the horde. I slowed down, the car pushing through the first few ranks, the wipers struggling to clear the gore from the windshield. I realized then that I wasn't escaping. I was just moving from one room of the tomb to another. I looked at the passenger seat. There was a briefcase there, the president's personal satchel, likely tossed in during the initial panic. I opened it with one hand while steering with the other. Inside wasn't a set of codes or a secret weapon. It was a photo of his family, a half-eaten granola bar, and a small, leather-bound Bible. I started to laugh then, a dry, hacking sound that turned into a sob. I was a Secret Service agent. I was a ghost. I was a survivor. But as I looked out at the ruins of the world's most powerful city, I knew that the badge didn't mean a damn thing anymore. The Empire was dead. The machine had stopped, and I was just a man in a metal box, driving into the heart of a nightmare that had no end. I gripped the wheel tighter, pushed the accelerator to the floor, and headed straight into the thick of them. The engine's roar my only prayer. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have a destination. I just had the drive to stay alive for one more minute, one more second, in a world that no longer had a place for the living. The sun was setting, casting long, bloody shadows over the District of Columbia, and as the darkness took hold, I realized I wasn't just a ghost in the machine. I was the last spark in a cold, dead furnace, and I was going to burn until there was nothing left but ash. The tires screamed as they chewed through the soft, decaying matter of what used to be a crowd of tourists on Pennsylvania Avenue. I didn't look back. I couldn't. Every time my eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, I saw the faces of the people I had failed to protect. Not the president, not the cabinet, but the citizens who had looked to the White House as a beacon of stability, while the world dissolved into a cacophony of gnashing teeth and wet, tearing sounds. The armored Suburban, a black beast of a vehicle that had once been a symbol of untouchable power, was now a battered sled of steel, its hood crumpled and stained with a dark, viscous mixture of oil and old blood. The steering wheel vibrated with a rhythmic thud, thud, thud as I rolled over the remains of a barricade near the Treasury building. The skyline of D.C. was a jagged silhouette against a sky the color of a bruised plum, the smoke from a dozen uncontrolled fires twisting upward like the fingers of a drowning giant. My hands, gloved in tactical Nomex that was now shredded at the knuckles, gripped the wheel so hard I could feel the bones in my wrists popping. I was hyperventilating, the air in the cabin tasting of ozone, copper, and the stale, recycled scent of my own fear. The engine roared, a guttural, mechanical scream that felt like the only honest thing left in this city. I hit a patch of slick gore, and the back end of the truck fishtailed, slamming into a line of abandoned taxis. The glass shattered, a diamond shower of fragments spraying across the dash, and for a second, the world went silent. Then, the scratching started. It began as a faint sound, like dry leaves skittering across pavement, but it grew into a frantic, rhythmic drumming. They were coming out of the shadows of the monuments, pouring out of the subway grates like a black tide. I slammed the shifter into reverse, the transmission groaning in protest, and floored it. A head, pale, hairless, and missing its lower jaw, thudded against the driver's side window, leaving a smear of gray brain matter and black bile on the ballistic glass. I didn't flinch. I was past flinching. I was in the red zone, that psychological state they train you for, at the academy where the world narrows down to a single point of survival. But they never told us what to do when the point of survival was a hollowed-out shell of a civilization. Suddenly, the dash radio crackled. It was a sound I hadn't heard in 6 hours, not since the last frantic transmission from the Pebble bunker went silent. It wasn't the rhythmic pulsing of an automated distress signal. It was a voice, a human voice. Aegis to any remaining units. This is Bishop. I am at the secondary extraction point. Foggy Bottom. The nest is compromised. I have the package. Repeat. I have the package, but we are pinned. Where the hell is the cavalry? My heart stopped, then restarted with a violent kick against my ribs. Bishop. That was Miller, my mentor, the man who had walked me through my first day on the detail, the man who had taught me that the badge wasn't just about the person holding the office, but the continuity of the American experiment. And the package? That could only mean one thing. There was someone left. Someone essential. I didn't think. I didn't weigh the odds. I spun the wheel, the Suburban's heavy-duty suspension groaning, as I leaped the curb of a median, heading toward the West End. The streets here were tighter, choked with the wreckage of an evacuation that had turned into a slaughter. I drove through a phalanx of stalled buses, the metal screeching against metal, a sparks and steel symphony that drew the dead toward me like moths to a funeral pyre. I saw them in the periphery, thousands of them, a sea of gray skin and tattered suits. The former elite of the world's most powerful bureaucracy, now reduced to a singular, mindless hunger. I hit the siren, not because I thought it would clear a path, but because I wanted them to look at me. I wanted to be the distraction. I reached the coordinates near the State Department, a concrete canyon where the shadows felt heavy enough to crush the lungs. There, huddled behind an overturned armored transport, I saw the flicker of muzzle flashes. Bishop was there, his back to a reinforced door, his Sig Sauer spitting lead into the darkness. Beside him was a figure in a charcoal gray suit, huddled low, a briefcase handcuffed to their wrist. It was Secretary Vance. The man was third in the line of succession. A cold, calculating politician I had never liked. But in this moment, he was the last scrap of the machine I was sworn to serve. I roared into the plaza, the Suburban's bumper acting as a plow, scattering a dozen of the shambling horrors like bowling pins. I slammed the brakes, sliding the massive vehicle sideways to create a wall between the survivors and the encroaching swarm. "Get in! Get in now!" I screamed, leaning over to throw the passenger door open. Miller didn't hesitate. He grabbed Vance by the collar and threw him into the back seat before diving into the front. He looked like a ghost. His face was covered in soot, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a frantic, vibrating energy. "Drive!" he roared, slamming the door just as a dozen pale hands began clawing at the exterior handles. I didn't wait for a second invitation. I punched the gas, the tires spinning on a layer of spent shell casings, before grabbing the asphalt and launching us forward. For 3 miles, we didn't speak. The interior of the car was thick with the smell of cordite and the secretary's expensive, cloying cologne, which now smelled like a mockery of a world that no longer existed. Vance was sobbing quietly in the back, clutching the briefcase as if it held the keys to heaven instead of whatever encrypted codes were now useless in the face of the apocalypse. Miller was reloading, his hands steady despite the chaos. I felt a surge of hope, a rare, poisonous thing. Maybe we could make it. Maybe there was a redoubt, a hidden airfield, a way out of this nightmare. "The airfield at Andrews is gone, kid," Miller said, as if reading my thoughts. His voice was a dry rasp. "We're heading for the waterfront. There's a cutter waiting at the Navy Yard. Private extraction. Just for the high-value assets." I looked at him, then at Vance in the rearview mirror. "And the rest of the detail?" I asked. Miller didn't look at me. He just stared out the cracked windshield at the burning ruins of the Smithsonian. "There is no rest of the detail. It's just us. And the boat only has room for 2. The words hit me harder than any of the collisions I'd survived that day. My grip on the wheel faltered. 2? "Miller, there's 3 of us." He finally turned to look at me, and that was when I saw it. The betrayal wasn't in his words. It was in his eyes. They were cold. They were the eyes of a man who had already decided who lived and who died. "Vance has the protocols for the continuity of government," Miller whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the engine. "He has the biometric keys. He's the only one who can authorize the final sanitization of the D.C. basin. Without him, the whole coast stays a dead zone forever. I'm his security. You're just the driver, kid. You weren't even supposed to be on this shift." A cold, hollow realization settled in my gut. The machine hadn't just stopped. It was eating its own. We were half a mile from the Navy Yard when the first engine warning light flickered on the dash. The radiator had been punctured blocks ago, and the temperature gauge was pinned into red. Steam began to hiss from the edges of the hood, a white veil that obscured the road. I slowed down, my mind racing. Miller's hand moved, almost imperceptibly, toward his holster. He wasn't going to let me even reach the dock. I was a loose end. I was the witness to the moment the Secret Service stopped being a brotherhood and started being a liquidation squad. "Look out!" I yelled, swerving violently toward a concrete pylon. It was a feint, a desperate gamble. As Miller braced himself against the dash, I reached for my own sidearm, but I was too slow. The car slammed into a stalled Humvee, the impact throwing us all forward. The airbags didn't deploy. They'd been disabled by the damage. and my head cracked against the side window. White light exploded in my vision. Through the ringing in my ears, I heard the door open. I felt the cold night air rush in, smelling of salt and decay. I struggled to move, my limbs feeling like lead. I saw Miller dragging Vance out of the back seat. The secretary was stumbling, his face a mask of terror. Miller looked back at me, just once. There was no pity in his expression, only a grim, professional necessity. "Sorry, kid," he muttered. He didn't shoot me. He didn't have to. The sound of the crash had been a dinner bell. From the shadows of the shipping containers they were emerging. Dozens, hundreds, a moving carpet of the damned. Drawn to the steam and the noise, Miller and Vance began to run toward the pier, where the silhouette of a small, fast-moving boat was visible in the moonlight, its engines idling with a low, rhythmic thrum. I pulled myself out of the wreckage, my boots crunching on broken glass. My left leg was a scream of agony, a piece of the doorframe having sliced deep into my thigh. I leaned against the steaming ruin of the Suburban, watching my mentor, the man I had trusted with my life, flee toward safety with a man who wasn't worth the dirt on my boots. The betrayal felt like a physical weight, heavier than the badge, heavier than the duty. I was alone, truly alone. The dead were closing in, their movements jerky and unnatural, their eyes reflecting the pale light of a dying moon. I reached back into the cab and grabbed the leather-bound Bible from the passenger seat. It felt solid, real. I also grabbed the emergency flare gun from the glove box and my last spare magazine. I wasn't going to die cowering in a metal box. If I was going to be the last spark in this furnace, I was going to make sure the fire was bright enough to be seen from space. I started to limp toward the pier, not to catch the boat. I knew I'd never make it, but to finish the job. Not for Vance, not for the government, for the oath. The oath wasn't to a person. It was to the idea that we don't leave people behind. The first one reached me near a stack of crates. It was a woman in a naval uniform, her throat torn open, her eyes milky and vacant. I didn't waste a bullet. I swung the Bible, the heavy, metal-edged cover catching her across the temple with a satisfying crack. She went down, and I stepped over her, my breath coming in ragged, bloody gasps. I could see Miller and Vance at the end of the dock now. The boat was pulling closer. A man on the deck was holding a rifle, scanning the shoreline. "Miller!" I screamed, the sound tearing at my throat. He didn't turn. He was shoving Vance onto the boat. The secretary scrambled aboard like a rat, still clutching that damn briefcase. Miller was about to jump when he stopped. He looked back at the swarm that was now between me and him. He saw me. He saw the flare gun in my hand. I didn't aim at the dead. I aimed at the boat. The cutter had several fuel bladders strapped to the stern for the long trip out to sea. It was a massive fire hazard, a tactical error born of desperation. "The machine stops here, Miller!" I yelled. I pulled the trigger. The flare erupted in a brilliant, blinding crimson streak, arching through the night sky like a falling star. It hit the stern of the boat with a wet thud, and for a heartbeat, there was nothing. Then the world turned into fire. The explosion was a physical blow, a wall of heat and sound that threw me backward onto the hard concrete of the pier. The fuel bladders went first, a geyser of orange flame that consumed the back half of the boat instantly. Then the main tank went. The shock waves shattered what was left of the windows in the nearby warehouses. I watched, my vision blurring, as the boat, the only hope for the package, the only hope for the men who thought they were too important to die, was swallowed by the Potomac. I saw Miller's silhouette for a fraction of a second, a dark shape against the inferno, before he vanished into the white heat. The silence that followed was heavy. The dead had stopped moving. For a moment, even they seemed stunned by the magnitude of the destruction. The fire reflected in their hollow eyes 1,000 tiny suns dancing in the dark. I lay on the ground, the heat from the burning boat warming my skin. The first time I hadn't been cold in days. I felt a strange sense of peace. The betrayal was washed away in the fire. The mission was over. There was no more Aegis. There was only the river, the fire, and me. I rolled onto my back, looking up at the smoke-filled sky. I could hear them again, the scratching, the shuffling. They were recovered from the shock, and they were hungry. I reached for the Bible, clutching it to my chest with one hand, and gripped my Sig Sauer with the other. My thumb flicked the safety off. It was a mechanical click, small and insignificant, but in the ruins of DC, it sounded like a thunderclap. They began to crest the edge of the pier, a silhouette of grasping hands and broken bodies. I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt a grim, terminal clarity. I was a Secret Service agent. I was a ghost. I was a survivor, and I was going to make them work for every inch of me. I sat up, leaning my back against a mooring post, and leveled my weapon at the first shape that emerged from the smoke. The fire from the boat was dying down, the shadows stretching long and hungry across the wood of the dock. I took a deep breath, the air tasting of salt and ending. "Come on, then," I whispered to the darkness. "I've still got 15 rounds, and I'm a hell of a shot." The first one lunged, its teeth bared in a frozen snarl. I squeezed the trigger. The muzzle flash illuminated the world for a fraction of a second, a brilliant, defiant spark in a world that had gone cold and dark. And as the empty casing hit the wood with a hollow tink, I knew I wasn't just burning out. I was lighting the way for whatever came next, even if it was only the silence of the ash. I fired again and again. The rhythm of the shots was the only heartbeat the city had left, a steady, defiant pulse in the center of the nightmare. I would fight until the slide locked back on an empty chamber, until the last ember of the boat faded into the black water, until there was nothing left of me but the memory of a man who stood his ground when the world fell down. The darkness took hold, but as I saw the next wave of them coming, I realized I was smiling. It wasn't the laugh of a madman. It was the smile of a man who had finally found the end of his watch and found that he was still standing at his post. The Empire was dead. The machine had stopped, but the man was still here, and I would burn until there was nothing left. The slide locked back with a sharp, metallic clatter that sounded like a tombstone dropping into place. I didn't panic. Panic was for the people who still had something to lose, and as I stood on the scorched remains of the South Lawn, looking out toward the dark, churning bruise of the Potomac, I knew I had given everything away. I reached for my belt, my fingers moving with the mechanical precision of a man who had spent thousands of hours on the range at Beltsville. But the pouches were flat, yielding only the ghost of a weight. I was out of magazines for the SIG. I dropped the weapon, the heavy, reliable companion of my career, and it disappeared into the tall, unmanicured grass that had once been the pride of the National Park Service. I drew my backup, the subcompact Glock tucked against my small of back, and the movement felt surreal, a dance step practiced in a dream. The air was thick with the smell of ozone, wet earth, and the cloying sweet rot that had become the atmosphere of the new world. I could see them now, cresting the rise near the fountain, a sea of ragged silhouettes caught in the flickering, dying orange glow of the fires burning in the West Wing. They didn't scream. They didn't shout tactical orders. They just came on with that relentless, dragging shuffle, the sound of 10,000 dry leaves blowing across a graveyard. I fired the Glock, the muzzle flash illuminating the wreckage of a life I barely remembered. Each shot was a punctuation mark at the end of a long, bloody sentence. I thought about the first time I walked through the North Gate, the weight of the suit, the pride of the star pinned to my chest. I had sworn to protect the constitutional order, to be a shield for the office of the presidency. I had done that. I had stood by while the world unraveled, watching the most powerful men on earth reduced to trembling shadows in the PSEO bunker, watching the phone lines go dead one by one until there was no one left to call. I had seen the president, a man I had shared coffee with, a man whose children's birthdays I knew by heart, turn into one of them. I had been the one to chamber around and ensure the office remained vacant rather than occupied by a monster. That was my true final service. The boat I had just seen disappear into the blackness of the river carried the last of the staff, the last of the data, and perhaps the last hope for a cure or a record of what we were. My job wasn't to be on that boat. My job was to make sure nothing followed it. The Glock went dry faster than the SIG. I didn't even bother to count the rounds. I just felt the vibration of the last one leaving the barrel and the subsequent hollow click. I tossed it aside. I was down to the steel now. I drew the tactical knife, the blackened blade drinking in the meager light. My lungs burned, each breath a struggle against the soot and the cold. The first of them reached me, a man who might have been a tourist once, wearing a shredded I Heart DC t-shirt that was now more red than white. He lunged, a clumsy, snapping motion, and I stepped inside his guard. It was muscle memory. It was Glencoe. It was the thousands of hours of hand-to-hand drills that I had once thought were overkill for a man whose job was mostly standing behind a rope line. I drove the blade upward into the soft space at the base of the skull and felt the familiar, sickening jolt as the light left those clouded eyes. I pushed him away, using his momentum to pivot toward the next one. They were closing in, a tightening noose of the damned. I felt a sharp pain in my shoulder, a glancing blow from a set of jagged fingernails. But I didn't have the luxury of checking the wound. I was a dervish of movement in the ruins of the empire. I slashed, I stabbed, I used the butt of the knife to crush temples. My suit, once crisp and professional, was a rag of wool and Kevlar, soaked in a cocktail of fluids that no dry cleaner could ever touch. I found myself laughing then, not the laugh of a man who had lost his mind, but the laugh of a man who had finally found the absolute truth of his existence. We spend our lives building walls, passing laws, and creating hierarchies to pretend we aren't just animals in the dirt. But here, in the shadow of the Washington Monument, which stood like a broken tooth against the sky, all of that was gone. There was only the blade, the breath, and the next 10 seconds of survival. I was the last agent of a dead government, the last sentry of a fallen city, and there was a strange, terrifying beauty in that purity. The moon broke through the clouds for a moment, casting a pale silver light over the carnage. It revealed the sheer scale of what I was facing. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, drawn by the sound of my gunfire, a slow-motion tidal wave of gray flesh. I backed toward the heavy stone pillars of the south portico, the white marble stained with streaks of soot. I could feel the heat of the fire behind me, the West Wing finally surrendering to the flames I had set to ensure the sensitive documents didn't fall into the hands of whatever scavengers came after the dead. The heat was a comfort. It felt like a solid thing at my back, a wall of energy in a world that was freezing over. I thought of my wife, Sarah. I thought of the way she used to look at me when I came home late, the way she would complain about the long hours and the secrecy. I hoped she had made it to the evacuation zone in West Virginia. I hoped she would never know exactly how this ended. I wanted her to remember me in the suit, standing tall, the man who guarded the world. I didn't want her to see this version of me, the blood-slicked butcher, holding a dulling blade in the ruins of a dream. I took down 3 more in a frantic blur of motion, my arm feeling like lead, my grip slick. My heart was a drum beating out a rhythm of defiance that seemed to echo off the monuments. I was the pulse of the city. As long as I was moving, DC wasn't dead. As long as I was fighting, the United States existed. I wasn't just a man. I was a living monument to a concept that was older than the stones under my feet. I thought about the oath again. Against all enemies, foreign and domestic. I suppose these were domestic. In a sense, they were the people I had sworn to protect, transformed by a biological betrayal into the very things I had to destroy. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was the shepherd culling the flock because the flock had turned into wolves. A heavy-set one, wearing the tattered remains of a Metropolitan Police uniform, slammed into me, knocking me back against the marble. I felt a rib snap, a white-hot flash of agony that threatened to dim my vision. I roared, a sound that was more animal than human, and drove the knife into the side of its neck, twisting with every ounce of strength I had left. We went down together, a tangle of limbs in the dirt. I scrambled to my feet, my breath coming in ragged, wet gasps. I could taste the copper of my own blood. My vision was tunneling, the edges of the world fraying into a dark, static-filled haze. The wave was almost upon me now. The circle had closed. There was no more room to maneuver, no more ground to give. This was the X on the map. This was the final stand. I looked up one last time, past the reach of the grasping hands, past the smoke and the fire. The Washington Monument stood tall, a silent witness to the end. Further off, I could see the faint, flickering light of the boat, now just a tiny spark on the horizon of the water. They were clear. They were out of the kill zone. I had held the line. A sense of profound peace washed over me, a tranquility that seemed at odds with the violence of the moment. I had done my job. The Secret Service doesn't get to choose the outcome of the battle. We only get to choose how we stand when the battle comes to us. I had stood. I had stayed at my post until the very end. I felt the first of them grab my jacket, pulling me toward the center of the mass. I didn't fight the pull. I leaned into it. I dropped the knife, my hands now empty, and I reached into the hidden pocket of my vest. My fingers found the cold, smooth metal of the thermite grenade I had kept for the very last moment. I didn't need the knife anymore. I didn't need the Glock or the SIG. I didn't even need my name. I was the fire. I was the light that would burn away the shadows, if only for a few seconds. I pulled the pin, the small, sharp click, lost in the chorus of moans. I felt the heat begin to build in the canister, a promise of a sun that would never rise. I looked at the closest face, a young woman, her eyes empty and glazed, and I didn't see a monster. I saw a citizen. I saw someone who needed a peaceful end. The world seemed to slow down. The sound of the wind, the crackle of the burning West Wing, the dragging feet, It all faded into a single high-pitched note of clarity. I saw the history of the house behind me, the ghosts of the giants who had walked these halls, and I felt their presence like a weight on my shoulders, a collective nod of approval. "You did well, son," they seemed to whisper through the smoke. "You kept the watch." I closed my eyes and pictured the boat reaching the far shore, the people on it stepping out into a new world, carrying the memory of the old one with them. That was my legacy. Not a statue, not a book, but a few more heartbeats for the human race. The heat in my hand was a roar now, a star being born in the palm of my hand. I didn't feel the pain of the teeth or the claws. I only felt the warmth. I thought of the light inside the Oval Office on a late winter night, the glow of the desk lamp against the dark wood, the feeling that as long as someone was awake in this house, the world was safe. I was the one who was awake now. I was the last light in the White House. And as the thermite ignited, turning the darkness into a blinding, beautiful white, I knew that I wasn't falling. I was ascending. The fire consumed the suit, the badge, the blood, and the pain, leaving nothing behind but the brilliance of a duty fulfilled. The silence of the ash followed, but it wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the quiet that comes after the final note of a great symphony, the stillness of a job finally perfectly finished. I was the Secret Service. I was the shield, and as the light expanded to fill the universe, I finally, truly went off duty. The morning would eventually come, though I wouldn't be there to see it. The sun would rise over a city of ghosts, casting long shadows across the charred remains of the South Lawn. It would shine on the empty casings, the broken knife, and the scorched circle of earth where I had made my stand. It would shine on the monument, still standing, and the river still flowing. And perhaps, somewhere far downstream, someone would look back toward the city and see the smoke rising from the house on the hill. They would tell the story of the light they saw in the middle of the darkest night, a spark that refused to go out until the way was clear. They wouldn't know my name, and they wouldn't know my face, but they would know that someone had stayed. They would know that when the world fell down, one man had stood his ground. They would know that the watch had been kept, and that because of it, the dawn was still possible. That was enough. In the end, that was more than enough. The man was gone, but the flame he had lit would burn in the memory of the survivors, a steady, defiant pulse in the center of the nightmare, a reminder that even when the empires fall, the soul remains unbowed. The darkness took the city, but it could never take the light. And in that blinding final white, I was home.